Imagine, just imagine, spending your entire life dreaming of soaring through the skies only to find yourself crashing into the ground at 135 miles per hour. Imagine thinking your life was over only to wake up outside of your own body, looking down at the wreckage. This is exactly what happened to Dale Black, a 19-year-old pilot who never expected that one flight would change everything. What he saw, what he learned, and what he experienced beyond this life is something we can all learn from. So stay with me until the end of this video, because Dale's story isn't just about surviving a plane crash. It's about what happens when we step beyond the veil of this world and into the next. Here's a brief audio clip from Captain Dale Black.
I was looking down at my body and recognizing that I couldn't be dead because I'd never felt more alive. I looked down and saw, oh my gosh, that poor young man Dale. He died so young and he had so much to do. And then all of a sudden, I began to realize, this is about 20 seconds later, I began to realize, oh my gosh, I'm a spirit and I have a soul and I used to live in that body.
Dale's story begins on July 18th, 1969. It was just another beautiful day in Hollywood, California. The weather was clear, no wind, no storms, perfect conditions for flying. Dale had arrived early at the Burbank airport, ready for another routine flight, transporting bank checks across the state. He was a licensed pilot, but at just 19, he wasn't yet experienced enough to fly the Piper Navajo Chieftain, a 10-seat twin-engine aircraft without supervision. His mentor, Chuck, was in command that day, along with another pilot named Gene. Dale sat in the co-pilot's seat, ready to assist. But just before takeoff, something unusual happened. Chuck tapped Dale on the shoulder and signaled for him to switch seats. Dale moved to the temporary third seat, and Chuck took over as co-pilot. Then they were cleared for takeoff. The aircraft accelerated down the runway. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. The moment they lifted off the ground, Dale sensed something was wrong. The engines were out of sync, creating an eerie, unsettling sound. They climbed higher, but their ascent was sluggish. Then Chuck pointed to a clear area and said, "Let's land there." That's when Dale realized they weren't going to make it. Before he could react, Chuck grabbed the controls with both hands, pulling them all the way back. The left wing clipped the tops of tall trees, spinning the plane sideways. The last thing Dale heard before everything went silent was Chuck's final words. "Oh my God!" And then impact. The aircraft slammed into a massive concrete structure, a mausoleum dedicated to deceased pilots. The impact speed, 135 miles per hour. The plane shattered into thousands of pieces. The 3 pilots were ejected, falling 70 feet to the ground. The next thing Dale knew, he wasn't in the plane. He was floating above the crash site. He could see the wreckage with perfect detail, the broken pieces of the aircraft scattered across the ground, the fuel leaking everywhere, the eerie stillness of the aftermath. At first he was confused. He looked down and saw 3 bodies, motionless, broken, lifeless. One was unrecognizable. The injuries were catastrophic. The second, Chuck, Dale's mentor, the man he admired, lay lifeless on the ground. Then he saw the 3rd body. It was him, his own body crumpled, bloody, lying among the wreckage. For a moment he didn't understand. How could he be looking at himself? Panic should have set in, but instead Dale felt oddly calm. There was no pain, no fear. If anything, he felt more alive than ever. He watched as engineers from Lockheed Martin, who had seen the crash, ran toward the scene. He saw them kneel beside the bodies, checking pulses. One by one, they checked the first body. Dead. They moved to Chuck. Dead. Then they checked me. The realization hit. I'm dead. There was no heartbeat, no breathing, no sign of life. He tried to call out to them to tell them, "I'm right here." But no one could hear him. That's when he noticed flashing red and blue lights. An ambulance had arrived, skidding to a stop near the wreckage. Paramedics jumped out, moving with urgency. Dale watched, fascinated, as they rushed toward the bodies. One of them knelt beside him and immediately went to work, pressing down on his chest. CPR. Dale observed, detached yet deeply curious. He knew they were trying to save him, but it felt strange to watch from this perspective. And then, without warning, everything shifted. It was as if an invisible force grabbed him, pulling him through the air. He was no longer hovering over the crash site. He was following the ambulance. The vehicle sped through the streets of Hollywood, sirens wailing. Dale wasn't inside it. He was outside, chasing it, as if he were tethered to his body, but not quite inside it. He could see through the windows. Inside, paramedics were working frantically, cutting off what remained of his clothing, trying to keep his battered body alive. One of them called out his vitals, though Dale couldn't quite make out the words. Another paramedic was squeezing a breathing bag over his face. Dale had no control over what was happening. He was simply watching. There was something surreal about seeing himself like this. His lifeless body mangled and broken as people desperately tried to bring him back. It was so clear now that his body was just a shell. The real him was out here, floating in the air, watching everything unfold. And then another shift. He wasn't outside the ambulance anymore. He was in the hospital. The chaos of the emergency room unfolded beneath him as he hovered just below the ceiling, looking down at his own body. Doctors and nurses were moving quickly. Someone shouted instructions. The bright overhead lights reflected off surgical instruments as a team of medical professionals worked over him. He was still dead, and yet he was fully aware, more aware than ever. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Just as he was beginning to grasp the reality of his death, everything shifted. It was like watching an old film reel spinning before his eyes, but instead of his entire life, it was one moment, a pivotal moment from childhood. He was 11 years old, kneeling at an altar during a church camp in Southern California. He could see his younger self, wide-eyed, innocent, and full of faith. In that moment, Dale had been praying to receive Jesus Christ into his life. He had meant it, every word, every emotion. He had given his heart to God that day. And now, as he hovered above his broken body, Dale understood something profound. He had once been deeply passionate about God, but over the years he had strayed, becoming self-centered, focused only on his ambitions, his dreams, his success. This realization hit him harder than the crash itself. He hadn't rejected God outright. He still believed, but he had stopped truly living for him. And now, here he was, dead. And yet, he was fully aware, more aware than ever. It was then that something extraordinary happened. He felt it before he saw it, a force pulling him, lifting him, drawing him away from the hospital. The emergency room, the doctors, the sound of beeping monitors, the frantic voices, it all started fading into the distance. At first, it felt like he was being carried backward through space, floating effortlessly, moving faster than anything he had ever experienced before. The walls of the hospital blurred, then vanished entirely. He was no longer on Earth. Dale found himself surrounded by darkness, but it wasn't a cold, empty void. It was vast, endless, like deep outer space. And ahead of him, a light. It wasn't just any light. It was alive. The closer he got, the brighter it became, far brighter than the sun, yet it didn't burn. It radiated warmth, love, and something indescribable. He knew where he was going. This was heaven. And he wasn't alone. 2 angels flanked him, one on either side. He hadn't noticed them at first, but now he could sense them, their presence powerful yet comforting. Though he didn't turn to look, he somehow knew what they looked like. Tall, radiant beings with golden bronze hair, dressed in robes woven with silver threads. Their faces shone with an otherworldly beauty, and though they didn't speak, he felt their joyful presence surrounding him. They were escorting him. He felt completely weightless as they travelled, gliding at an unimaginable speed. Yet there was no fear, no resistance, only peace. Dale was drawn forward, his entire being pulled toward the magnificent light ahead. He wasn't just approaching a glow, he was approaching a city unlike anything on earth. The walls shimmered as if they were made of pure gold, but not the kind of gold he had ever seen. This gold was alive, radiating a brilliance beyond anything he could describe. The grass itself glowed, pulsing with energy, each blade seeming to hum with music. Not just sounds in the air, but a symphony that flowed through everything. It was in the ground beneath him, in the light, in the very air. And it wasn't separate from the city. It was the city. Everything in heaven was alive. Everything was connected. And then he saw them. A group of people stood near the entrance to the city waiting for him. They weren't strangers. They were familiar, though he couldn't say why. Their faces glowed, their eyes filled with love. There was no division, no race, no separation, only unity. And when they embraced him, Dale felt something he had never fully experienced before, a love so pure, so unconditional that it erased every insecurity, every fear, every doubt. For the first time in his life, he truly belonged. No expectations, no judgment, no need to prove himself, just love. And as he stood in this radiant place, feeling more alive than ever before, he never wanted to leave. A message entered his mind, not spoken, but known. It's not your time. It wasn't a voice he heard with his ears. It was inside him, outside him, everywhere, all at once. It was powerful yet gentle. It held authority yet infinite love. Your work is not finished. This was the voice of God. Dale instantly understood. He had to go back. He had a mission to fulfill, a purpose that hadn't yet been completed. But he didn't want to leave. How could he? This was home. This was where he belonged. Dale tried to resist, tried to move forward again, but before he could beg to stay in this place of unimaginable beauty and love, the force pulling him backwards was stronger than anything he had ever felt. He was falling, down, back towards earth, back towards the pain, back toward the broken body in the hospital bed. And then he woke up. He had been in a coma for 3 days, and he could hear the beeping of hospital machines filling his ears. The bright white lights of the emergency room blinded him. His entire body ached with excruciating pain, pain so intense he could barely breathe. Every joint, every muscle, every shattered bone throbbed with agony. His chest felt crushed, his head pounded, and his limbs were so damaged that it was almost unbearable. The hospital bed beneath him was hard and cold. The air smelled of antiseptic. A dull, steady hum of voices surrounded him, though he could barely focus on anything beyond the overwhelming pain. But there was something else, a presence. Not a doctor, not a nurse. It was God. He could still feel the lingering love from heaven, like a whisper against his soul, reminding him of what he had just seen, just experienced. And then, in a hoarse, weak whisper, his first words slipped out. What happened to my eyes? The nurse turned in surprise. Dale couldn't see her clearly, but he could feel the weight of her stare. She thought he was talking about his injuries, the severe lacerations on his face, the eye that had been badly damaged and stitched shut. But that wasn't what he meant. His vision had changed. It was like someone had taken black and white glasses off his eyes and replaced them with high-definition, full-colour, multi-dimensional sight. Everything was more vivid, more real than before. He could see beyond what was in front of him. He could sense things, feel things, understand things in ways he never had before. Something inside him had changed forever. And then his second words came out, words that surprised even him. Do you know Jesus? The words left his lips before he could even think about them. It was the only thing that mattered now. Everything had changed. Dale Black had been given a second chance. Dale's road to recovery was brutal. He endured multiple surgeries to repair broken bones, intense pain as he slowly regained movement, struggles with memory loss and vision problems, doctors telling him he would never walk again. Despite it all, he refused to accept their prognosis. With unshakable faith, he declared his healing out loud every day. I will walk, I will fly, I will see. Over time, the impossible happened. His vision fully returned without surgery. His crushed ankle healed, avoiding amputation. He learned to walk again, defying medical expectations. He passed his FAA medical exam and became a pilot again. Against all odds, he spent the next 40 years flying planes. Even though his life had been transformed, Dale didn't talk about his near-death experience. For 4 decades, he focused on living out his faith, helping others, flying planes, and doing mission work around the world. The only person he told was his grandfather, who encouraged him, live by what you saw, not just by what you say. And for years, Dale did exactly that. After 40 years, Dale felt a growing pressure. He couldn't keep his experience to himself anymore. At first, he wrote his story just for his family, but God had other plans. His testimony spread, and people begged to hear more. Eventually, he published his book, Visiting Heaven, his first full account of the crash, his near-death experience, and his miraculous recovery. Here is a brief audio from Dale Black.
It was 40 years later, and I just felt like my heart was being pounded on and my ribs were being nudged, and I couldn't sleep until I agreed, okay, Lord, all right, I'll do it. I'll tell the story and we'll put it in writing for family. And then when I'm gone, whatever you want to do with it. Of course, God had other plans. And my wife was a large part of the making of this book.
Apart from his grandfather, he didn't tell anyone for over 40 years. Can you imagine carrying something like that for so long? Maybe it was fear of being misunderstood. Maybe it was just too overwhelming to put into words. Or maybe back in those days, people wouldn't have believed him. But today, more and more people are opening their hearts to these kinds of experiences. We hear stories like Dale's, stories of near-death experiences, of life beyond this world, of something greater waiting for us. So I ask you, if someone told you this story, would you believe them? Would you listen with an open mind? Or would you dismiss it as imagination, as a trick of the brain? And if you were the one who had this experience, would you tell the world? Or would you keep it to yourself, unsure if anyone would understand? If you would like to binge watch anything and everything to do with the afterlife, click onto this end screen or save it for later when you want to sit back and relax and remember. You are never truly alone.